know if that means like I'm going to bore myself or what, but no. If you would open your Bibles, please, to Esther chapter 1. Esther chapter 1. No, excuse me, Esther chapter 2. Esther chapter 2. We're going to be looking at verse 19 and all the way down through chapter 3. So kind of a larger section this morning as we dive into this. Into the story of Joseph, I think I've mentioned it already in looking at the story of Esther here. And it's often used to show how God can use sin sinlessly, and specifically what we often think of as kind of the end of the story where Joseph's brothers are there bowing down and before Joseph, and they're worried now, like, you're going to come and take us out and kill us. And Joseph says, hey, look, like you meant this for evil, but God meant this for good. And it really does illustrate that so very well, because it is a painful and difficult truth. And it does do that very well, but there's also another aspect of that story that's often overlooked. And one of the commentators, Loudon, was actually writing about this, and I think it's probably the most fitting introduction we could have this morning in our passage. Because earlier in the story of Joseph, there's also that aspect in Genesis 39 where we find Joseph first being sold into slavery, and he finds himself in Potiphar's house. And you know, as he finds himself there, and he just pours himself in the duties and the responsibilities that he has there. And Potiphar realizes, like, he's got like this fantastic find, this person that he cares, and really everything that he does, God blesses. And it's like he puts more and more that he can into his control, into his hands. And it just goes so well, to the point where Potiphar's like, I don't have to worry about anything. Joseph just has it taken care of. And it's going really, really well for him. And then suddenly, after all that, we have this physical description of Joseph given. And I've never really thought about it much before, but Loudon pointed out, like, anytime you have in Scripture some kind of a physical description, you have to be aware it's relevant to the story. And it describes Joseph as a very handsome and fit young man. And it doesn't escape the notice of Potiphar's wife. And she starts kind of seducing him and coming on to him, and it's like, hey, sleep with me, come and sleep with me. Nobody's going to know. And you think about the position that puts Joseph in. Like, if it was in our own day and age and that was happening to someone and they asked me, what should I do? I was like, look, you talk to HR, quit your job and go somewhere else. There's all kinds of things and options you can do, but what's Joseph supposed to do? He's a slave, he can't quit. He could go to Potiphar. Do you really think that would go well? I mean, Potiphar is almost obligated to believe his wife over his servant. Even if he knows and is suspect over what's going on, he really can't do that. Joseph has really no recourse but to faithfully do his job, and every time that he is solicited by Potiphar's wife, to just say no. And that's what he does. Until finally, I think Potiphar's wife sets him up and makes sure that nobody else is going to be in the house that day, or at least at that moment. And he comes in to do his job and responsibilities, and she just throws herself at him. And he does the only thing he really can do in that moment. He runs from there, leaving his coat behind, and just gets out of that situation. He does the right thing, and he's wronged because of it. Potiphar's going to take that coat that she now has in her hands, bring it before her husband, and say, look, he was trying to come on to me. And I wouldn't be surprised if Potiphar was probably a little wise to this whole situation that's going on. Like, But again, what's he going to do? Choose a servant over his own wife? But I think that's the only reason Joseph survives. But now here he is in prison. And it's hard because Joseph does the right thing, and he's wronged because of it. And we can wonder sometimes, like, why is it when I do the right thing, things don't go well for me? That's what we would expect. I made the right decisions in life. I made the right choices. I chose to honor God, and look what happened. I'm suffering, or I got passed over, or something didn't go well for me. Why am I wronged and returned? You think about what might have been going through Joseph's mind as he's now in prison. What if I just slept with her? Sure, it would have been wrong, but I wouldn't be in prison right now with no hope of getting out. To be able to start playing that what-if game or that if-only game. If only my brothers hadn't sold me into slavery, I'd never be in this position. The reality is a lot of those things are true. They are true, but it doesn't do him any good. And it doesn't change the fact that what he did in that moment with Potiphar's wife was the right decision. and yet he suffers because of it. Mordecai could probably sympathize with Joseph here, because Mordecai is going to make a right decision, and ultimately what results of that will endanger not just his life, but the lives of the entire Jewish population living within the borders of the Persian Empire. If that doesn't give you second thoughts, I don't know what does. Maybe I should have allowed this to take place. What we have to remember at the end of the day, though, is that we do not control the outcomes of our decisions. In fact, we cannot even surmise what the outcomes of our decisions and our choices will actually be. Most of the time we can figure it out, and most of the time we're going to be pretty accurate. Well, if I do this, then this will happen. Yeah, and that's normally the way things work. But you don't actually have that as a guarantee in life. Joseph does the right thing, suffers. Mordecai does the right thing, suffers. You maybe do the right thing and possibly suffer. Doing what's right may result in you being wronged, yet God can work all things out together for our good. So let's start by reading chapter 2, verses 19 through the end of the chapter. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. And in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh were two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. And when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. And what we find here is that Mordecai is doing, in fact, the right thing. And as we start, we realize that Esther and Mordecai are still very much an inseparable pair. They had grown up that way, or at least Esther had grown up that way. And now that she's in the palace itself, we realize that she's not, gotten too big for her corset, if you will. That she still has a relationship with Mordecai, who raised her, who treated her well. And it would have been easy for her that she's queen. She's over him. She has authority and power, and yet she's not forgotten where she's come from. And I can imagine that's really going to be especially important for her, because now, even though that she's married here, Xerxes is never going to be the kind of husband that people would dream about having. The relationship that they would have had with each other is probably wholly unique in that. It would never be a normal one. And so the relationship, the integrity between Esther and Mordecai is important. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if Esther is the one that got Mordecai his job, because he's in a different position or situation in life now than when he was earlier. He's now sitting in the king's gate. He's now sitting kind of within the palace grounds, if you will, and has much easier and better access to Esther and her to him than she would have, and than either of them would have had otherwise. And so I think she probably put a good word in for him. But the key takeaway to those first couple of verses is this: that her secret identity, that she is a Jew, has been kept intact. And we can't be sure exactly how all these events fit into each other with this one and what follows, but it's possible that 5 years have gone by already from the time that Esther's become queen until this story now is unfolding. It's a long time to keep that secret, but somehow she's been able to maintain that this whole entire time. And that brings us to this other part of what we would call attempted regicide. Now, if you saw that in the bulletin, like, what in the world does that mean? It just simply means the murder of a regent or a king. And I know that sounds like something on gas station TV, your cheddar word of the day, so to speak, that you might find once in a while. But that's just what that's what we're kind of going with here. But it was the attempted murder of the king. And Mordecai becomes aware of this. And this attempted assassination by Bigthan and Teresh. And we don't know why they were upset at the king. And there's probably any number of reasons what you could choose in there. But they became so upset. It had to be something significant. And it doesn't really even matter what it is, but the fact is that they were willing to start conspiring against the king, and Mordecai finds out about this thing. And you have to understand, like, he's meant to hear this. He's meant to hear that this is not an accident. Like so many of the other events in Esther, they're not accidental. They can seem like they're random, or by chance, if you will, but they're not random. Like, Mordecai is in this position to hear this conversation for a reason. He's meant to hear it. This is meant to take place here. And so he goes and Esther tells the king on behalf of Mordecai of what's going on here, and they do this investigation, and sure enough, it's found to be true. And and they are hanged on the gallows. Now, this hanging is important because it's not what you probably think. And when I was in college at Northland, we had a class, I think it was King's. I'm not 100% sure if it was that one, but it's an Old Testament class, and we had one of these professors, Dr. Arndt, and it's not the most exciting professor you could have. But this one particular class in which we would talk about this particular topic was legendary among the student body. And all the previous classes that had it would all encourage the other ones, like when it gets close, be ready for this. And they would just tell us what it was, and we knew what to look for it. And I think this is the highlight of the year for this professor every single time, because you just get a big grin on his face, which is uncharacteristic for him. But he would describe what this gallows was. And if you're thinking the gallows are kind of something going on in the Wild West, and you throw a rope over a tree and hike them up or something like that, or even back in the medieval times where you did the platform, they drop the bottom out from underneath you, that's not it at all. You would prefer that, trust me, over what this actually is. And what they would do is they would get a big, long wooden stake buried in the ground, and literally what they were doing, they were impaling you on it. And to make sure that we understood what this means, and the professor would then give us this great mental image, and so they would stick you on this like a giant corn dog. So that was his thing. So it was like a giant corn dog. So you'll never eat corn dogs the same way again without thinking of Esther. So you're welcome. And but that's kind of what was going on there. And you can imagine how horrific that kind of a death would have been, because I mean it's sealing its own entrance wound. In other words, you're bleeding out on the inside. But this is a prolonged and humiliating and painful way to go. I need an example. And this is what these guys were suffering. This is the way that the Persians executed the people that were in violation of its laws. That's what they're suffering. So you have to understand that, and that becomes important again later as well. But Mordecai is the one who does this, and all of this is recorded in the Chronicles of the King, like who did it, when, where, what happened. All this is very important, but it's recorded here. And it begs the question a little bit, was Mordecai right to stop this assassination? Because remember, he's a Jew living in a foreign kingdom. It would have been so easy for him to hear about this and think, yeah, he's kind of a jerk. And that's the end of him. Was he right to stop it? That's a question you actually have to wrestle with a little bit more. But, at the end of the day, you have to understand and think through, well, who's going to replace him? Is there going to be a civil war? What happens to Esther? If the king, her husband, is executed or assassinated, what happens to her and her livelihood and her ability to continue to live? Or will she be ruined or destroyed because of it? Those are real questions. Does he have an obligation to the state because of the job that he's chosen? I think the answer to all those is yes. He has an obligation. He has to do this. He's right to do this. And yet you realize that if he had allowed this to go on, the rest of the book of Esther either would look very, very different or not exist at all. Like it changes everything. Like he makes the right decision, but what comes from that is totally not what we would expect. And at some point he's going to figure that out. And it makes you wonder, have you ever gotten into a situation where you've played the what-if game or the if-only game with your own decisions in life? That you make a decision, it may be in a moment, and you think, it seemed like the right thing to do, it seemed like the right decision when we were there, and then all these things happen as a result of that, and you're sitting there going, if I'd only gone left instead of right, if I'd only stopped at that stop sign, if I had simply gone red instead of blue, the list goes on of all the different scenarios, all the different things that you could have chosen and done differently. Say, if I had just done that, none of these other things would have happened. But that might be true. Maybe not, but it might be true. But we start wrestling with some of those things. And what we're really doing is we're trying to avoid facing some kind of painful experience or really mourning the lack of control that we now feel in a moment. It's so easy to regret a decision when its outcome isn't what you imagined it would be. And I've sat with those who've mourned a tragedy of a family member, and they're wrestling with something, and they made a good decision in the past. It was a painful decision. It was a hard decision. And it's a fuzzy memory for me, and I wish I could remember more about it, but I don't know if there's somebody in here or somewhere else that I heard it, but they were talking to me, and some kind of family tragedy happened. They're mourning this. So what makes this so hard? It was like 20 years ago. that I think there was something wrong with the pregnancy itself, and they wanted us to abort this child. And we were like, we didn't do it. We didn't do it. And I think everything turned out normal. It was a normal, perfectly healthy child. But now here they are sitting 20, 30 years later, and they're looking at the curve of this child and the direction they've gone, and they're thinking, maybe we should have. Maybe we should have. Maybe that was the wrong thing. And I thought, are we really having this conversation? Like, no, that was the right thing. Save the child's life. But in the moment, and they knew about it, they were believers, but in the moment they were looking at this and going, man, but we could have spared maybe ourselves and so many other people grief and heartache and everything else if we had just done that. See, in the moment, in tragedy and grief and those kinds of circumstances, you can second guess any and every decision. When I talked to them, I said, no, that was the right thing to do. Just because of what happens or what that person became doesn't change the fact that that was still the right thing to do. You're not going back and saying, if only or what if on that. Should we have saved that child's life? Should we have done that? Absolutely. But you can't help what they've become. You can't help what the choices that they've made later in life. But don't look back at that with regret. But I think all too often we can play that what if game or that if only game because we're struggling with some of the things that have taken place because of that. Mordecai, I think here in this moment, is actively seeking the good of the city, as Jeremiah the prophet had told him he ought to do 100 years earlier. We understand that he's going to be wronged for doing it, wronged greatly for doing it. See, the thing is, we never really know what will become of our actions. Even when we are sure that what we are doing will go well, or it's the right direction, or the right thing to do or to say, you never really know what's going to come of it. At times like these, you realize how out of control of life you really are. I know we love control. We like to think that we can control and direct things, and most of the time things go the way we expect, but not always. And Mordecai's going to find that out. We would expect the next scene now to detail some kind of reward for Mordecai. Instead, his life is going to be threatened. Let's start reading in chapter 3, verse 1 through 6. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were with the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to him, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's word would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, and throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. And we'll stop there. Mordecai's reward really goes to another. Now, we find here really an enemy in the gates. If you remember, we said that who Mordecai was. We got this long description of who he was, the son of, the son of, the son of. And one of those descriptors was the son of Kish. That's King Saul's father. So you understand who Mordecai is. And this is where this becomes important. Because Haman now, we're being introduced to the very first time, we find is an Agagite. Now, if you go through your Bible or you look at the maps in the back and you start trying to find, okay, where are the Agagites? You're never going to find anything. You will find probably some places where the Amalekites lived, and the king of the Amalekites was Agag. So that's the king that King Saul was supposed to kill way back when it was time, the time of the Amalekites was fulfilled. God sent Saul and Israel over there to attack and annihilate them, completely and totally destroy them. All of the men, the women, the children, the livestock, everything was supposed to be destroyed. And what does Saul do? He saves Agag alive, kind of probably as a trophy, and then brings a lot of the livestock back with him. And then Samuel goes and greets him and says, "Hey, who's this? And what's the bleating of the sheep that I hear in the background?" And Saul goes on to say, "Well, we figured we'd save kind of the best alive as a sacrifice," and so on and so forth. And then Samuel goes and says, look, God values obedience more than sacrifice. And then Samuel dispatches Agag and kills the rest of everything else that's going on there. But that's the connection that's going on between these two. And so I think, Mordecai's looking at this and thinking, like, he's this Agagite, and he just has a disdain for him like no other. And it's an animosity that's centuries old. And he's overlooked, and this enemy, this person that his ancestors were supposed to take out, was promoted into this position. Now, was it Mordecai's position? Who knows? But we're so expectant to see Mordecai promoted, and we find this Haman, this guy, that they have a history together, kind of like a long time ago, but there's a history together. And that's the guy who gets promoted. And Mordecai can't stomach this, and that's a hard pill for everybody to swallow. And the king actually has to issue a command. Now, that's something that's easy to miss here. But in verse 2, you saw that the king had so commanded concerning him, like especially in those cultures, like some kind of salute or reverence or a bowing would have been almost by default. You would salute, soldiers always salute those who are in higher rank to them, and that's just the way that it works. And why does the king have to issue an edict for him to be respected this way? And I think the reason is because Haman was not a respectable person. No one wanted to respect him. And you put that kind of power into the hands like that, it's disastrous. There's an old Italian proverb that says that beware the person that has nothing to lose. And I think Haman's that kind of a guy, that he has found a way to claw his way to the top, and he will do whatever he possibly can to keep it. Like there's nothing sacred to him, nothing that you can take away or do, because he's willing to sacrifice absolutely everything to get it. He's a very dangerous man. And here he is. And so Mordecai's refusal to bow, for whatever reason, doesn't go unnoticed. Now, Haman never notices it until it's pointed out to him, but other people around do. And they're looking at Mordecai like, what's your problem? Like, the king told us this. And you have to understand that Haman isn't just refusing to respect Haman. He's also directly disobeying the edict of the king. There's kind of a double whammy that's going on here. And the only reason we get is that he's a Jew, which really doesn't hold water very well, and it probably didn't hold water then very well either, because certainly Mordecai was bowing down to the king, and traditionally Jews didn't have an issue with just showing respect and bowing to those that were in authority, kings and the like. Like that was not really an issue historically for the Jews. It doesn't work here. It's simply his pride really getting in the way. He will not bow down to an Agagite. And for some reason, Haman doesn't want to take out Mordecai, which is weird because I think it's in verse 6. He says he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai. And you're like, why? Why didn't he just kill him right then and there? It would have been so easy. And it could just be he just thought it was beneath him. This is such a petty, ridiculous, I don't want to be bothered with this. It might also be that if Esther actually put him in this place, he realized there's a sense in which I want to be careful here because the queen put this guy in this position. I don't want to make a move as if I'm against the queen. So he's being very calculated, very careful here. That's what I think maybe is going on. But instead he realizes, I'll just take out the Jews. That's this people group. Most of us don't like them. And they're the people that are responsible for wiping out all of my ancestors. There's some incentive there. And that's what he decides to do. Now, you think about this, there's no way that Mordecai could have realized that his actions would lead to this degree of hatred and animosity from Haman. And Haman should have known, or Mordecai should have known, you can't just disregard the edict of a king and think nothing bad is going to happen to you. There had to have been a sense in which he realized, this is not a hill you want to die on. This isn't that big of a deal. It's really beyond logical to throw your life away, or at least potentially throw your life away for this. But it seems like that's what he's doing. Now the question for us again becomes, is Mordecai right here? Is Mordecai right in refusing to bow down? And I think the answer to this one here is no. I think he's wrong. We don't have all the details here, but I think he's wrong. If he refused to bow to everyone, I think that would be different. But it feels like he's singling out Haman above everybody else, and inadvertently endangers the entire lives of the Jewish nation in the process. And it really accomplishes nothing. But see, this is also where we can find some hope. Hope and encouragement. Because I wonder what was going through his mind when he learned about what was going to happen here. And let's be honest, we've all done stuff in our lives that we truly regret. Now, not kind of like the if only the what if kind of things, like it was a good decision, but now there's unintended consequences. But sometimes we've gone through things and we knew better, we did it anyway, and now we're dealing with the consequences and we're like, oh man, now what? And it can really be anything, and sometimes things that are not so easily undone. Whether you're not some people would say, like, I think I married the wrong person. It's kind of a big deal. Maybe they were unbeliever, maybe because of something else that was going on, but I married someone that I knew better. I was warned about, I shouldn't marry, I shouldn't do this. Or I did something and I estranged my children. Or I said some things and really hurt a dear, lifelong friend, and they won't talk to me anymore. Or like, and you could just fill it in. Maybe some career choices. I made some career choices in my life, and like I made a lot of money, but I had to compromise my faith over and over and over again to keep my employment. And you're looking back and like, man, what was that? Was it worth it? And you can, the list is long. Like we're talking sinful choices here, things that were truly wrong, or at best questionable. And think, man, what have I done? And now looking back with those kinds of regrets and thinking, like, now what? Now what am I supposed to do? And you understand that God can use that too. God can work all things together for our good because He's sovereign over those things as well. It doesn't make them right. But it doesn't certainly mean that you're off the table, that God can no longer use you to accomplish things, that He can no longer work through you. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that at all. And you look at this passage and you wonder, what would have happened if Mordecai just bowed down to the Jews, or to Haman? Would they have never been in danger? We don't actually know that, because we do know later in the book that the Jews had various enemies within the kingdom. And God gives a great victory to the Jews over their enemies later on because of what's going on here. So perhaps the threat would have just been in a different place and in a different way. But God's going to work through this one. And God can work through you and your life choices and things that go on too, even the ones that you want to regret. And you think, man, if I could undo that, but it was wrong and it was sinful, like seek the forgiveness of God and say, okay, what can I still do? And realize God can still use you. Going to a Christian college, we would hear and share testimonies like all the time. And of course, for myself, going there and, I grew up in a Christian home, and I made a profession when I was 3 and then again when I was 15. And, it's like, never really had anything that you would look back on and say, wow, that was terrible. I, sowed my wild. It's like I never had a moment in my life where it was like that. And then you hear these other college kids, and they're like coming out of the the roughest backgrounds, and their parents are unsaved, and they were like doing drugs, and they were doing their lives were like falling apart and absolute messes, and they reached the bottom. And like people like me, we look at that and it's like, man, what an awesome testimony. Like I wish I had a testimony like that. Because you start saying that kind of stuff, you're like, wow, they want to hear that. You stand up, you give your testimony, and people are like, yawn. And then you talk to those guys who have those awesome testimonies. You know what they tell you? I wish I had yours. Because I had to go through all of those trials. I had to go through all of those situations before Christ found me. And there's scars. There's things that are in my history that I wish weren't there. And yet God used those very same things to get them to a place in which they came to know Christ. It's amazing what God can do. But you realize that there's nothing in your past, there's nothing in your history that God cannot work through and with and on to do what He wants to do. You're never off the table. But it matters, though, that the fact that you come before that and say, I don't want to do that anymore. You turn from that sin and you turn towards God. But God can use even those things, even the things that you regret and think, man, I wish that wasn't there. That's fine. But know that God can still use and work through that even then. He's going to do it here. He can do it with you too. Now, it's not looking for good right now in this situation. But God is working even in the littlest of details. And that's one of those things that's so important for us to remember, that even the smallest of events, God controls. And we're going to look at that now, verses 7 through 15. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month, to the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's law, so that it is not to be the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also to do with them as it seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all peoples to be ready for that day. The courier went out hurriedly by the order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. What we have here at the beginning here is Haman goes down to discern, like, when should this happen. He wants to have a date in hand before he goes to the king to get his ring and his signature on it. And so they cast lots, or Purim, for it. And so when you understand that, they've actually dug some of those up. Those basically dice. They've dug some of those up, even from a time period like maybe before Esther, like the 800 or so BC, and they look very much like what we would consider modern dice for the most part. And it's kind of neat to the way to see that. But they used them for divination to kind of see like what would have been maybe, for all intents and purposes, like the lucky days on which certain events and things should happen. And they would sit down at the beginning of the year and they just start rolling the dice to kind of line up when certain events would do. And this was one thing on the docket. When should this thing happen? And Haman was trying to find that lucky day. And now, you can't actually get into this passage without thinking of Proverbs 16:33, which says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." You know, the Feast of Purim, that the book of Esther seeks to explain the reason for its existence, is named after the lot. It's like the Feast of Dice is basically what it's described as and called. And what we realize is what they're saying here is that the fact that God controls even the most seemingly random events like the casting of dice, even as Proverbs puts out, like casting dice and allowing it to be in your lap, in which you could manipulate exactly where it falls and how it falls and maybe even how long it rolls until you get the number that you want. And he's saying, you know what, God controls that still, like when that number or what number you get. Those things, no matter how much you're trying to be in control of that, it's still outside of your control. And that was never lost on the Jews. And the reason for that is because as Haman is doing this, he's casting these lots, and I'm sure he's casting lots, and he's hoping, okay, let's get this number on the road. Like, he's hoping for Tuesday. He's hoping for like a Tuesday. And they're casting these lots probably in the beginning of the month, so like for our, more our understanding of January, instead of getting Tuesday, he gets like the middle of December. I mean, you can imagine what's going through his mind. Like, I have to tolerate this guy for like 12 more months? Are you kidding me? It's ridiculous. This is never lost on the Jews. That's why the whole entire feast is called and named after this, because it gives them precious time. Time to prepare, time to do something, time to sit in sackcloth and ashes. It's never lost on them of what happens here because of these lots. And Haman then finally, he's got a date. He doesn't like it, but the lots picked it, so that's what it is. And he goes to the king and gets his consent. And the details that he's giving there is almost criminal, how much he's like a certain people group disobeys certain laws. And it's so nondescript. He doesn't want to be specific for whatever reason. And maybe what's worst is that Xerxes Ahasuerus, he never asked for any more detail. He never asked for any more detail. He's like, oh, okay, whatever. I think part of it might be just because the massive amount of money that he's promising him there. 10,000 talents was nearly 2/3 of a year's worth of taxes for the empire. It's an obscene sum of money that he's promising. Again, like we said before, it's probably the spoils of the people that will be killed, and he's promising all of that money that's from them, I'll give to you. It's a horrendous amount of money. And all the money that he would have lost at during the wars and things like that he lost and wasn't able to take from the Greeks. I'm sure he was poor as far as that kind of stuff goes. It was attractive, and I think because of that kind of money too, he was maybe hesitant to ask questions because he knew I want to probably claim ignorance on this one. I don't want too many details. I might feel guilty. I don't want that. And so the king approves this arrangement, and the scribes are then called out to write this edict down. And they do so on the 13th day of the first month. Doesn't seem like a big deal. And then it's issued out. Many of the Jews will probably hear about it the next day. A day that for the Persians would have been meaningless, just the next day, the 14th. But for the Jews themselves, very significant. And you can't miss this because I think there's something that we're meant to see. This can't be an accident. But the 14th day of the first month is Passover. Many of the Jews, especially the closer ones, and the Persians had an early form of what we would call like the Pony Express. It would have gotten out there very, very close. But all this is going on right around the day of Passover, the most significant and holy day the Jews have. And it's a day in which they celebrate every year, as they've done for hundreds of years, the deliverance of God, of the people of Israel from the most powerful nation then known on the earth, Egypt. You think about, is that not a glimmer of hope? This terrible news comes out to them on the anniversary of the greatest deliverance they've ever known and experienced. And it's almost like a promise and a reminder to them, look, hey, it's really this call of future grace. Like I will continue to do in the future what I've always been in the past. You can trust me here. You need to trust me here. And that's really what was a major theme in Vacation Bible School this past week. That as we were talking about the Jews wandering through the wilderness, and the thing that the phrase that they kept emphasizing in the material was like we can trust God. God knows what we need. We just need to trust Him. And here again, the Jews are looking like, we need deliverance. And He says, I know what you need. You just need to trust me. Look, you're hearing this news on Passover. I've done this before. And it looked hopeless. You're in Egypt for so long. If there's any way for you to get out on your own, you would have done it already. And you couldn't. Not until I came along. I involved myself in the situation that was going on, and I brought you out of Egypt powerfully. Don't you think I can do this again? And that's the day they get the news. Don't worry about this. God knows what we need. And Esther has probably one of the most improbable endings you can imagine. But it was never a surprise to God. All of the small details come together at just the right moment to great effect. I think in closing we can think just here of 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 20, because I think it certainly fits. It says, for what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. You know how strange in our text here that Mordecai finds himself on both sides of that verse. And I think the reality is that all of us from time to time find ourselves on both sides of that verse. That sometimes we go through hardship and trial and we have to look at ourselves and think, yeah, I kind of brought this upon myself. And then there are other times in which the reverse is true, like I did the right thing and I'm suffering because of it. Either way, we realize that God is in control and will work in and through the situations that we find ourselves in. Whether you're regretting a good decision or a bad one, it doesn't matter. God can work through it and use it. And the fact that you're still in the middle of something, it's not resolved yet, and think, where is God in all this? Well, He's not finished working yet. You just need to trust Him. Watch how God can use the most extraordinary of events to bring about the most spectacular conclusions using the smallest of details. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you've given and for allowing us to come together and to study this story and really a major turning point in the book. And to be able to look at what happens between Haman and Mordecai and to a point Esther. and how so many things are ramping up. And Lord, like all of us, there's times and moments in our lives where we've made decisions, and some of them, we start regretting them. Sometimes they were good decisions, sometimes they were bad decisions, but we can start regretting and just mourning what's gone on and the situation we find ourselves in. And instead of doing that, Lord, to be able to come back to you and say, Lord, I'm just going to trust you in this. I wish things were different. They're not. But we start clawing after control so often in life, in the situations, instead of just saying, Lord, I don't know why all of these things are going on right now, but I'm choosing to trust you. Lord, it's particularly hard in some aspects to do that in the book of Esther because your name is never mentioned there. And yet, Lord, the direction, some of the actions that they do sometimes forces us to think about the fact that, but it feels like they were moving and doing some of the right things. The sackcloth, the fasting that we'll see and learn about later, Lord, it feels like they were just doing some of that. Or even the name of the feast itself of Purim. Well, that's recognizing certainly that something had gone on or happened that allowed them to have so much time that things could take place and unfold in a different way than what it seemed like they would on the surface. Lord, it's so hard to trust you. And we don't know the end. We don't know the how. Well, that was certainly true of the children of Israel, whether in their wilderness or even in this moment here in history, but it's certainly true of us too. Lord, help us to trust you. And whether or not we've made good decisions that we start playing, if only I'd done this, that, and the other thing, or we're regretting something that we've done in the past, like, man, Lord, I think I've disqualified myself. And of course, there's going to be consequences to that, but to realize, like, Lord, you can use even those moments strategically, using sin sinlessly. And we can have a small part. I'm thankful, Lord, that you can use us and all of our shortcomings and all of our failings and all of our questions and all of our doubts and still accomplish your will. Thank you, Lord, for such great and precious promises. In Christ's name, amen.
If you'll please stand with me.